Hello, I'm Steve Balch, Director of the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, and I want to welcome you to another of our Institute Encounters, in which we have prolonged and interesting, I hope, talks with the various guests that the Institute brings to Texas Tech to lecture. Today we're very delighted to have Professor Alexander Beecroft, who is the Jesse Chapman Olkarn Memorial Professor of Foreign Languages at the University of South Carolina, and very interestingly an authority on both ancient Greek and ancient Chinese literature and many other things besides. His most recent book is An Ecology of World Literature, and he is now working on a prodigiously ambitious undertaking, which is entitled A Global History of Literature. So that's a great deal to take in, and we'll see if we can explore some facets of it today. One of the things that you've related to me is that if you take a look at ancient Chinese literature, there aren't clear lines to be drawn, as sort of we sometimes like to do in academia, between, say, literary writing and what might be called philosophical writing. That's the case, I take it.
Yeah, or the categories are not quite the same as we would think of in the West.
So there is, if you look at this ancient literature, less clarity in the division between what we might call, say, poetry or philosophy. It's probably true in Greece and China, both. So taking kind of this a broad view of these ancient literatures, and looking specifically at the kind of philosophic side, what would you say is the main distinction between what's going on in these two very disparate parts of the ancient world?
Sure. Well, I think it's a really interesting question. I think, first of all, it's important to stress that it's these things are never absolute, right? And so there are always versions of just about any question that might get asked in the philosophical tradition in the West is asked somewhere in the Chinese tradition as well. I do think there are different emphases, particularly different emphases in the texts that survive, and some of that has to do, again, with why things survive. But the Chinese tradition does tend to place more emphasis on what we might call political philosophy, as opposed to metaphysics and logic and those kind of more abstract dimensions of philosophy. Not that they're absent in early Chinese thought, just that those were questions that for various reasons seemed less interesting.
And what are the major political questions that are central to the minds of ancient Chinese writers?
Well, I think they're not, in a way, very different from the questions that preoccupy Greek philosophers as well. So fundamentally sort of ethical questions, first of all, about how do I live a good life and how do I live a life in good social relations with the other people around me, including with the state of which I'm a part. And then, building on that, of course, how should that state itself be run? How can kings or emperors or rulers rule in a benevolent way, and behave towards their subjects in an appropriate way, and what do subjects in turn owe to their state and to their rulers?
So you see that to some degree in Greece too, with both Plato and Aristotle looking at the question of what a just person is as a way of talking about what a just state is. But tell us more about what the ancient Chinese would have thought.
Well, I mean, again, there are an incredibly wide range of views we get in different early Chinese texts. The texts that become the most influential in the long run are the ones we would call Confucian, right, and particularly the Analects of Confucius, as we call it. And there, I mean, we see certainly a strong interest in the idea of the importance of human relationships, first of all, as a way of understanding how both the individual and the state should be structured around benevolent and reciprocal relationships that are in most cases hierarchical, with the exception of friendship, which is also in Aristotle not hierarchical. And that's one of the most important dimensions, I think, in Confucian thought, is how do human relationships and how do we regulate human relationships? And there's a concept translated as ritual, li, in Confucius, which is very important here. And it doesn't simply mean the sacrifices you perform to your ancestors or other kinds of religious ceremony. It also really regulates all of human behavior. So the idea being that when you interact with individuals in any kind of social relationship you have with them, you know how to do so on the basis of an established body of ritual practice.
So does that mean in China, ceremony has more of a value in and of itself than in the Western world?
Or that it's a category that's much broader than it would be in the West. We don't tend to think of, how you and I are holding this conversation right now, for example, we wouldn't see that as a ritual activity, but in a certain sense, in the Chinese tradition, it can be seen that way. It can be seen as something that should be governed according to certain norms, and we wouldn't call that, we would distinguish that from ritual, perhaps.
I haven't brought out the tea, for example.
Yeah.
That sort of So, if you look at ancient Greek philosophy, one of the things that both Plato and Aristotle look at, and others, are types of regimes. Is that a kind of open question for so they have democracy, oligarchy, tyranny? Is that an open question for Chinese thinkers?
Not in the same way, and again, I think that's obviously it's important that Plato and Aristotle are themselves resident, at least part of their life. In the case of Aristotle, in a democracy, these are historically existing institutions in the Greek world that philosophy has to try to account for and explain. In China, where everyone lives under a kind of monarchical system, there isn't the need to explain an actually existing set of other political institutions. What there is a need for is a way of understanding the relationship between, for example, the ruler and his ministers, and exactly what we mean by minister as well, for that matter. And those kinds of relationships within the state can exist in a variety of different forms, in theory and in practice in China, and I think that's sort of the site of debate about political theory, if you like, is how much of a role should the emperor have versus the role that ministers should have, how much of the emphasis should be on punishment, for example, and maintaining control over the people through force, versus how much of a ruler's duty is to nurture the people.
So this is sort of the difference between legalism and what we now say Confucianism?
Well, Confucianism is kind of a middle ground, and then there are philosophies like Mohism, for example, that are further on the other extreme, if you like. But yeah, Confucianism does emphasize that rulers have obligations to their subjects as much as subjects to rulers, in the same way that we would say, and Confucius would say, that parents have obligations to their children as well as children to their parents.
And do these things get... These are aspects of the early period of Chinese thought, probably pre-dynastic period, sort of. Confucius is Spring and Autumn, so that's about 300 years before the establishment of the single Chinese empire. How do those particular disputes, the one you've mentioned, get worked out in practice?
Well, I mean, and history is very important here, right? So, as you mentioned, sort of in the late 3rd century BC, China is politically unified, first under the Qin dynasty and then under the Han. Gradually, during the Han and its successors, and even during the Qin, there's a search for political ideas that can help underpin a vast empire, and it can help legitimate that empire and ensure its ongoing viability. And at first, the emphasis is on a philosophy called legalism that emphasizes strict punishment and the use of force and fear and so on as strategies of rule.
Is there a notion in legalism that the government has a moral purpose?
Well, being the government is its own moral purpose in a sense, and that system is then retrospectively thought of as having been too extreme, having been too harsh, having not actually worked very well. And there's an ongoing search for other ideas of governments that might be more enduring. For a variety of historical reasons, Confucianism, as we know it, kind of emerges as the winner in that particular debate. Towards the end of the Western Han, which is to say, the last century or so BC, and then in the Eastern Han in the 1st century AD, that's kind of a moment where these questions get resolved in a certain sense.
And it's sort of a final resolution, isn't it? Until a very modern period. In that there really is a kind of hyper-dominant school of thinking about politics in China that you don't find in the West. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I guess you could say that. I mean, I would qualify that a little bit by saying, well, in the West, similarly, in classical Greek times, we have democracy alongside oligarchy and monarchy. By the Middle Ages, monarchy is pretty clearly won out in most places
there
for
are
a long
some
time.
republics, even in the Middle Ages. So
But a smaller number.
there's a variety of regimes in Europe because of its fragmentation. So do you think that the hegemony of Confucianism as a political philosophy is basically a reflection of the successful and enduring, with occasional breakups, unification of China?
Well, I mean, I think that contributes. And certainly, I mean, there are long periods, in fact, where China is not unified, but the notion that it should be remains important to a lot of thinkers throughout, and that ends up getting tied to Confucianism. The other thing I would add is that the other philosophical systems of the early period in China don't just disappear, it's more that they move to other aspects of life. And so Taoism, for example, which is just as ancient as Confucianism, if we want to think of it in those terms, ceases to be as active as a philosophy of government, but it becomes much more important, or continues to be important, as a philosophy of how to live your own life, right? And gets tied into things like practices of longevity, which are very important.
Well, what would Taoism tell you about living your own life?
Well, it kind of becomes something of an opposing pole within the Chinese system against Confucianism. And so Confucianism tells you as an individual that you have an obligation to serve the state, you have an obligation, if you're educated, to become part of the civil service to help make the state better. That was in fact a very risky thing to do most of the time in the Chinese world, partly because a lot of forces besides bureaucracy had a lot of power, eunuchs and the family of the empress and so on. And people who served in high positions in government had a short lifespan in those positions quite often.
It would have been true almost everywhere, though, in the
Exactly.
world that I read.
Well, absolutely. And Taoism, which contained with it a notion of retreat from the world and of trying to make your peace within the world rather than trying to reshape the world, then had an immense appeal for those who either had failed to achieve political careers or who had succeeded for a time and had then...
Now, Epicureanism sort of urged that kind of
Yeah.
thing, or kind of retreat, but not in the same way, I think, as Taoism. Taoism was a kind of spiritual retreat, wasn't it? There was a contemplative aspect of Taoism, which I don't think Epicureanism necessarily requires. It's sort of, you let your garden grow. In Epicureanism, you sort of retire to some haven of peace and tranquility, but you enjoy the ordinary pleasures of life within that, which that's not Taoism.
Well, I mean, it can be, certainly. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there's a strong tradition of poets, for example, from about the 3rd, 4th century onwards, 3rd, 4th century AD onwards, retreating to the countryside and writing about the simple pleasures of country life. In fact, very much cultivating their gardens in China. And Taoism is a much broader category than simply that kind of philosophical, spiritual set of reflections. It also does include things like practices designed to make you live forever, right? Which is not at all the same kind of thing, but very important to certain self-interested individuals.
Not a great track record on that, I suspect.
Yeah,
Right.
well, if it had worked, we would know that. I'm trying to...
So now there was an ethical side to Confucianism, which was a kind of microcosm of the macroscopic Confucianism. Macroscopic Confucianism is how you serve an emperor as one's father, so to speak, or the father of the state. Whereas the microscopic ties all that together to what you do in the family.
Yeah, no, I mean, there are 5 human relations that are seen as important within, traditional Confucianism, and the relationship of ruler and subject, husband and wife, parent and child, older and elder sibling, and then friends. Right? And these are the kind of fundamental human relationships, and each of those, except for friendship, is seen as a hierarchical relationship that involves mutual obligation on both sides, right? And I think that's always an important thing to emphasize in Confucian thought, that, husbands are supposed to regulate wives in this kind of very traditional sense, and as fathers, children, and rulers of the state, but they're also expected to behave appropriately as well. Like, there are expectations on both sides.
So in the Greek side there, you'd have kind of Aristotle discusses friendship, and friendship comes up in the Plato Symposium and other philosophic exercises of that kind. But do you get a theory of the family emerging in Greece?
Well, it seems to be less interesting to Plato in particular, I think, and from the Aristotle I know, certainly less central than it is to.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think it has to do with partly with the nature of the social institutions that surround philosophy, and in the Greek context, you have the idea of the symposium, the gathering of men to sort of sit around in the evening and drink, as a kind of, in a way, fundamental model for philosophical discourse. And the kinds of social institutions that the Chinese world had at the time look slightly different, and I think lead maybe to different kinds of conversations.
Are gender relations in each realm of philosophy taken for granted, or are they dealt with? Is there some effort in either or both of these philosophic worlds to spell out and justify what the relationship between the sexes should be?
Well, I mean, it comes up certainly in both places. As I've suggested, it comes up in Confucianism, and this idea of human relationships and marriage as one of those. Yeah, there's a certain amount of thinking about that. In the Republic, doesn't Plato talk about men and women and sort of speak in slightly complicated and I think anxious terms, in a way that he seems, on the one hand, to be asserting that women are as fit to be guardians as men are, and yet maybe not quite. Or I mean, it's a subject that he doesn't seem to have quite sorted out.
So it's unusually feminist for the time.
In that sense, in that it actually asked that question, right, I suppose. But
is that question asked in any Chinese literature that you're aware of?
Not in quite the same kind of way. What we do have from a very early period in China are women writers of various kinds, including women historians and women poets, women intellectuals of all sorts, who are actively engaged in all of these discussions themselves.
So there are, on the Greek side, of course, some female poets, Sappho, are there others?
A couple of others.
And there are some women who show up in either in Socrates' discussions about his past and where he got his wisdom from. What do you have on the Chinese side?
So on the Chinese side, in the Han Dynasty, for example, there's a family, the family Ban, who generate a series of scholars and intellectuals at the court, one of whom gets tasked with the job of writing the dynastic history of the previous half of the Han Dynasty. So there's a tradition that emerges at this point in China of each dynasty writing an official history of its predecessor. And so this history is begun in this case by a man, but continued by his daughter. Right, and she becomes a major intellectual figure in her own right as a result, partly of that work, partly of poetry she composes, and we continue from there onwards to have a significant number of women participating in intellectual life, not of course in public service, not in administrative positions within government, but within intellectual debate, certainly.
Well, it's interesting. Would a woman who is so if you were a son of a well-to-do family, that family would probably have its eye on the possibility that you could qualify for a civil service position, for a senior government position, and hence they would invest your time and their money in preparing you to take these exams, which were centered on the sort of the Chinese canon, largely Confucian text and poetic text and other things that a gentleman was supposed to know. Now, if you were a woman and you had a literary or intellectual bent, and your family wanted to help you further yourself in developing that, they wouldn't have to worry about putting you through the exam system, since you weren't eligible to hold those offices. Do we know whether women's literary and educations were different from men's? I'm just wondering whether under a system like that, if there were a sufficient number of well-educated women, you might find them producing more of the intellectual innovations because they could afford to do it, being outside of this kind of more rigidly prescriptive system of education that a man would be tempted to follow.
Well, I mean, it's complicated. And first of all, we'd have to historicize this, I think, properly, right? And the exam system emerges a little bit later than most of what we've been talking about right now. It's
right.
Sort of towards the end of the first millennium AD,
right.
that it becomes an important formal aspect of the system of government. That same general body of texts is the basis for the education of elite men much earlier. and of those elite women who sought an education as well, which wouldn't necessarily have been all of them at that point. One of the issues, of course, is always also first of all, what survives, and until printing emerges in the Song Dynasty, what survives in the Chinese world is erratic, just as it is in the West, and it's also, of course, what survives is what was valued by later tradition, and so. We have less of the work of women from earlier periods, even if there were a number of educated women who might have had very interesting things to say on these subjects. Partly because the people who were preserving the texts were less interested in
So in the last 1,000 years, we find examples of sort of women thinking outside the box in a way that would be uncommon for a man?
The last 1,000 years is not really my period in China. And it's a vast subject, so I wouldn't want to speculate in too much detail about that period. But there's a lot of intellectual activity certainly going on.
So there's also in China the Buddhist tradition that gets established somewhat later than the kind of Greco-Roman Chinese antiquity. But that kind of brings a very different strand of thought than Confucianism onto the scene. How do those two get along with each other? Those two rival, or potentially rival.
Well, it's a complicated relationship, and I would say, first of all, to begin with, that kind of Confucian orthodoxy we were talking about, it emerges in about the 1st century AD in its final form. Buddhism begins to emerge in China about 100 years later. So there's actually almost no time in which this sort of orthodoxy of Confucianism stands alone, apart from Buddhism. Thereafter, Buddhism is an influence. Those emperors sometimes, and certainly Confucian-educated officials, are often very skeptical of Buddhism and its influence. It can be seen as a kind of counterweight sometimes to Confucian thinking.
What are they worried about particularly?
Well, worried about a religion whose emphasis, a belief system whose emphasis is on nirvana, right, on withdrawing from the world altogether and ceasing to exist, as opposed to very much the here and now concerns of Confucianism and of bureaucracy, right? There's a certain tension there. Some individuals, I think, negotiated the integration of those things in their lives very successfully, others not so much perhaps, and different historical periods place different emphases within that system. It's a little bit like the relationship between Christianity and Greek philosophy in the West, where, again, some individuals saw themselves as participating fully in both of these systems, others only in one or only in the other. And in both cases, the two systems aren't entirely compatible with each other, or are on some level contradictory, and yet they're both seen as valuable and important to a lot of the people within each community. So, there's a lot of effort to renegotiate the terms of traditional Chinese thought. Taoism in particular changes a great deal in contact with Buddhism, so Taoist ideas begin to look a little bit more like an organized set of religious practices under the influence of Buddhism, under the competition, we might say, of Buddhism, and so on. And in a way, I think it begins to kind of clarify the idea that Confucianism is a rational, pragmatic, this world set of solutions to problems and way of looking at the world that is somewhat distinct from what we would call a religion.
So even when we make that distinction, we're really making a distinction based on the divergence that in part occurred, or at least the self-consciousness that developed as a result of the intermingling and tension between the two ways of thought.
Yeah.
What about aesthetic philosophy? Is ancient China and ancient Greece alike in being interested in questions about beauty?
Well, absolutely, and about what makes literature in particular. The theory of poetry and of literature comes in that same moment in the Han where political philosophy is beginning to kind of become orthodox. The interpretation of poetry gets fixed around a similar set of ideas, and there's a text that Mao prefaced to the canon of songs, one of the earliest poetic treatises, we might say, in the Chinese world, whose emphasis is on the idea that poetry, as Wordsworth says, really is a kind of spontaneous expression of human emotion, the Mao preface says, well, when your feelings get so strong that you can't keep them inside, you begin to say them. When simply saying them isn't enough, you begin to chant them, and then you begin to sing and dance. And so when your emotions get to an extreme point, you can't cope with things anymore, you sing and dance them out, and that's what poetry is. And because that's the basis for understanding poetry as this expression of inner intent, inner sentiment as well, that leads to a notion that there's a kind of homology between what goes on in poetry and what goes on in human life and in political life, and an idea that in a state that's well ordered and well governed, you should have happy songs, basically songs that show the contentment of the people. Poetry that's produced under less happy times will reflect that in some way as well, which leads both to a desire to create poetry that will fit the mood of the times. Obviously, if you're the ruler, you want that to be a happy mood, and also to seek poetry out from the people in a kind of way.
So there's a notion that you sort of, for the purposes of understanding whether your society is working well or not, be conscious of the folk cultures, the folk poetic cultures of the people.
Yeah, well, and there's a tradition, a kind of spurious tradition, but a meaningful one anyway, of something called the Music Bureau. This is a later invention more than a contemporary reality, but an idea that you actually sent officials out into the countryside to listen to the songs that were being sung by the people, and you brought those songs to the court.
It's a later invention that such a thing existed in antiquity.
Yeah,
it wasn't actually introduced later in Chinese history.
No. But they believed it was there, and I think it leads to taking popular songs seriously in that sense, and it remains an obligation or a concern of Chinese poetry throughout the history of traditional China, that poetry should express the concerns of the people in some kind of way. And so, if you're in a time of famine or civil war or something like that, major poets will, like Du Fu, the great poet of the Tang Dynasty, will often discuss these issues and, in a way, speak on behalf of people who are...
So the poet as tribune.
Yeah, very much so.
And was he heard?
Well, to an extent.
Was he heard later?
Well, certainly heard later, and
that people took him seriously as having a political message.
Yeah, very much so. And it also becomes then a way to talk about these kinds of political concerns, right? To refer to the poetry of earlier times, and you can always sort of, you invoke these poets. There's always a kind of plausible deniability then, right? Oh, I'm just quoting Du Fu talking about trouble in the Tang Dynasty. I didn't realize you thought this would have anything to do with you, sir. But
you get that in Shakespeare sometimes as well,
certainly
right?
that kind of idea. But because the Chinese poetic tradition is so long and deep and rich,
you can find a lot of it.
Yeah, it works very effectively for that kind of purpose.
So on the Greek side there, how would you compare their aesthetic theory to that of the Chinese?
Well, famously, of course, we think about Plato and Aristotle as the origins of Greek thinking on poetics, and there the emphasis is on mimesis, right, on imitation, on the idea that art imitates life. And I think a lot of that
sounds like a little bit of what the Chinese think as well.
Well, there are interesting overlaps, but the idea, and I think part of this draws on the importance of epic and tragedy in Greek literature of their time. Both of which are forms that tell stories, right? They're then seen as being stories that reflect something about a mythical or real past.
Not an obvious counterpart on the Chinese side of the early period.
Not in the early period, no. And what we do have is something that looks much more like lyric poetry. And so the emphasis more on this question of art imitating life, representing, reenacting life, which then, of course, for Plato becomes a concern about does it do it well? Yeah. And does even life imitate the world of the forms well enough? And since it doesn't, and then art doesn't imitate life well enough,
he worries about it.
He worries a great deal about it, and Aristotle tries to come up with answers. So on the one hand, you could see a kind of opposition between the Western mimetic poetics and this Chinese poetics about the expression of inner will and sentiment. And yet I think if you look not at the specific explicit treatises about poetry in both places, but if you look at the way people use and discuss poetry, you find interest in mimesis in the Chinese tradition. You certainly, from a very early stage, find interest in poetry as the expression of inner sentiment, and poetry as something that can regulate and manage the state in Greece as well.
What's an example of poetry as an expression of inner sentiment in Greece?
Well, lyric again, from the beginning is always has this sort of expression. Someone like Sappho talks about desire and love in these very powerful ways that aren't simply, mimesis isn't perhaps the most effective way of understanding what's going on.
So in Dionysian ritual, there's also this notion of intense emotion breaking out into singing and dancing and music and revelry, is there not?
Well, but the Greeks, of course, have their fascination with nothing in excess, right? And so, in a lot of ways, I think yeah. But I think the idea of tragedy then becomes, or comedy even, it's a form of doing that, but not too much, right? Just right. So you're at the stage where you enact the gods and enact heroes on the stage, but not when you get to the stage where you rip animals to pieces with your bare hands.
But isn't there a notion of the mean in Confucius as well?
Well, certainly, yeah. Mm-hmm. But poetry is seen more as, in a way, something that sometimes pushes away from the mean or indicates when the mean has been disrupted.
Does Confucius speak about poetry himself, as far as at least attributed to him?
Here and there, yes. In the Analects, we do have discussions of quotations from poetry, first of all. Traditionally, Confucius is said to have edited this great early anthology of poetry, the Canon of Songs.
I say,
And so we're told there were originally 3,000 poems. He got rid of the bad ones and the duplicates and condensed it to a collection of 300, which is impressive editorial work. and so that whole collection is seen, therefore, as reflecting Confucian values, which is not, which is a problematic way of thinking about it, but that's another story.
What about natural philosophy, interest in the natural world itself? Greek philosophy begins, actually, with people thinking about what makes the world that they observe tick. And while he's not absolutely the first person to think ethically, Socrates is often credited with a turn of putting it on a somewhat different track, or at least bringing forward the ethical elements. How much, and you can see that sort of remaining as part of one of the important preoccupations for those in the Greek tradition. Is that true, particularly for the ancient Chinese?
Well, and here again, it's important to emphasize that philosophy per se is a Greek word, right? And it's a Greek term to describe a set of Greek practices, and it kind of imperfectly fits what happens in China. The terminology that gets used there, we could say, is literature by masters, so texts by masters, people who are especially knowledgeable about something. And so that will include people like Confucius and Lao Tzu, the imagined author of the Tao Te Ching, the classic of Taoism, but it will also include Sun Tzu's Art of War, it will include agricultural treatises, every kind of practical knowledge as well as what we would call philosophy. Those are seen as an inseparable, indivisible body of learning in a certain sense. And so, questions that happen in early China about the nature of the universe and so on do come up in what we would call philosophical texts. Sometimes more in the sense of a skepticism about these questions, perhaps, rather than an attempt to answer them.
Taoism is sort of skeptical about whether you can know these things or should try. Or,
there's a famous bit of the Zhuangzi, isn't it? About there's a beginning, there's a time before the beginning, there's a time before the time before the beginning, there's a time of being, there's a time of non-being, there's a time before the beginning of being and non-being, and so there's an interest in those questions. There's an awareness there, questions that could be asked, but they end up not being as important to early Chinese thought or as interesting to as many people as similar questions are in Greek philosophy. And some of that seems to be just kind of for historically contingent reasons.
Well, one is never satisfied with the historically contingent. You want to place it. But it certainly is an interesting distinction. History is considered part of the classical body of texts in China, and I guess also in Greece as well. Are there interesting distinctions or similarities to be drawn in historical writing?
Well, I think one of the interesting things really is that history, as we know it in China, and it sort of gets defined as a discipline, really, if you like, or as a body of texts, has much more of an official orientation, right? So the first great historian, we're told, Sima Qian, the author of the Records of the Grand Historian, the Shiji, in the second, first centuries BC, this really crucial moment, is creating a narrative history that goes back to basically the dawn of time and moves forward to pretty much his own era, or the era of the emperor before him. But it is It is a text created within an imperial context. It's created using the imperial library. It's created with imperial support up to a point.
With imperial oversight as well.
To an extent, and then of course
He gets in trouble.
He gets famously in trouble, and famously is given the choice between death and castration. In fact, and he chooses castration rather than death.
So continues to work after that.
Exactly.
Does the flavor of the writing change? As people will be interested, I'm sure.
I think we would have trouble sort of sorting that out, but it is nonetheless. It's an interesting reflection that the writing of history is from the beginning then seen as tied to the state. Later on, we do get more texts that are created autonomously. But the idea also that history is a mirror for princes, you might say, that kind of
it's a body of lessons.
Yeah, exactly, and the same is actually true of earlier texts that have something of a historical orientation as well. And there are some chronicles and commentaries on chronicles that, again, mostly exist as a series of models, both for how to run things, how to wage war and peace, how to debate issues, but also, very much how to articulate these kinds of...
And the practice was to wait until the dynasty had fallen and another one had replaced it before beginning its official history.
Yeah, it was always a project of the next dynasty, which...
And that was to allow for some degree of disinterestedness?
I would say almost the reverse. No? I mean, I think the next dynasty always has a very powerful interest in shaping the narrative about its predecessor. Because one of the anxieties in any monarchical system is how do you justify the fact that you're not the guys who were in power last year, right, or 10 years ago. So writing a history of your predecessors helps to legitimate your own dynasty. Generally, dynastic histories follow a bit of a pattern where the previous dynasty started off great, noble, inspiring rulers who followed Confucian virtue, and then gradually that kind of falls away. Things get decadent and perverse, and we always have stories about the last emperor of each dynasty where he turns out to, usually have been sort of sexually problematic, but also to have been corrupt and gluttonous, and to have engaged in every kind of vice, and that's why it proved with the greatest reluctance necessary for someone to overthrow him.
There were a few tragic counterexamples in the last Ming emperor. Sort of, perhaps he doesn't really have the hand on the tiller firmly enough, but he kind of dies nobly.
Yeah, well, and that's, of course, as a result of foreign invasion.
Yeah.
Right, which then gets seen in a very different way when we get to
I see. So you can make more easily come up with sort of justifications for your last emperor if he's overthrown from the outside.
Well, and that is also 1,500 years later, so it's sort of happening in a different worldview in a sense. But that model, the dynastic history, and often we believe a number of the historical records of the dynasty were destroyed once the history was written. So in a way, the next dynasty came along, they reviewed the history of their predecessor, packaged it, narrativized it, and then destroyed the evidence. Right? So that here we are, this is the story of our predecessors and why we're legitimately their successor.
Mm-hmm. So in the Greek world, there's a different sense of audience. You have an official audience in mind when you're writing in Chinese official history. But the Greek historians, who are they thinking of as their audience?
Well, I mean, eternity in the case of Thucydides, isn't it? Or Herodotus, to that matter. They're thinking of kind of a future audience in many ways.
Remote posterity.
Yeah, but akatema sia, right? The possession for all time. But that also is a function of both of them writing partly for an Athenian audience, right, and a democratic audience at the time that they're writing.
Audience,
Yeah, and when we get to the Roman Empire, we certainly see the writing of history being much more closely tied to state power than it had been earlier.
Though not necessarily commissioned as such.
Not necessarily, but not necessarily exactly
watch your P's and Q's.
Yeah, or you're aware that it might be a good idea to watch your P's and Q's.
Yeah. So, in the case of Thucydides, though, and I guess a little less so maybe with Herodotus, you certainly have a didactic. I mean, Thucydides is always making points, even if they're sometimes just implicit points, about what's wise statesmanship and what's not. Is there some sense in which the kind of lessons he comes up with are different from that of a Chinese official historian?
Well, I mean, I would say an important part of dynastic history in China are always the biographies. Every one of these histories will have a section at the end of biographies of major figures of the dynasty. And those, I think, maybe the Western equivalent to think about might be Plutarch, Introductory, right, who also creates these very compelling biographical accounts
Right.
of major Greek and Roman
Right.
individuals,
Right.
and uses those biographies
Uh-huh.
as a way of reflecting on questions of virtue and vice, and how to live well, right, in some kind of way. We can extract philosophical, wisdom from reflecting on the lives both of the great and of the not so great.
Is that really the heart of a Chinese history, the biographies, more than the narrative?
In some ways. I mean, we'll have a sort of chronological narrative of history, we'll have these biographies, and then there are also always treatises on subjects of various kinds, agriculture,
Uh-huh.
canals, divination, all these different kinds of areas of thought, and those are incredibly valuable, of course.
So in that
reference.
respect, they had a notion of history that was more comprehensive, maybe more like that of ours today. They were interested in sort of history from below to some degree. I mean, you're doing agriculture, I suppose that's what you're doing. Than simply the history of rulers, great deeds, battles, whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that was certainly important to the story as well, but there was a sense that coming from Sima Qian onwards, that dynastic history should give a full picture of the state, including these other aspects. This is also where we have the first book catalogs in many cases, is that the catalog of the Imperial Library will be part of
the history,
Yeah.
So we know what was contained therein.
Yeah, and which is invaluable sometimes. We
It
often
includes
know.
documents.
Well, it's most of the texts,
The
right,
texts,
you would say. But sometimes that's our best source for an understanding of the particular text may or may not have existed in a particular period, is that the dynastic history will explain that it was in the library.
So your next project is this global history. And you're going to try to take not only the Chinese and the Western traditions, but all the great literary traditions, and try to find a kind of common intellectual frame for meaningfully looking at them, comparing and contrasting them, I guess saying something about the future, as all in the case of both China and Thucydides, you have lessons or some kind of forward-looking element. What is could you define that project for us in all its ambition?
Sure. Well, I mean, it is really quite literally what it says it is, in a sense, a history of written literature from the invention of writing in Sumer to the present day, or whenever I actually finish writing the book, in a year or two, all around the world. And so I do make the decision not to include oral traditions that have never been committed to writing, or that haven't ever meaningfully circulated in writing, simply as a way of trying to make the project slightly more manageable. And so, and first of all, there just isn't really a project like this at the moment, I think, a book that tries to do all of this in one place. So there's simply a value for trying to gather what we know about the literary traditions of the world into one place, whatever I end up saying about it, and I hope that's useful to people. I am interested in. I don't want to establish too much of an overarching narrative to this world literary history, because I think it's very complicated and very particular in different places at different times.
It would be deforming if you tried to squeeze it into it.
Yeah, there's no one story that I think can kind of simplistically be applied to it all. But I mean, I think one question that informs everything I'm trying to talk about is that the audiences for what we call literature, or the kinds of texts that we have, change over time, and in complicated ways, not in a linear way, but when you're looking at something like Homer, you can imagine an audience that's a community, perhaps a small-scale community, but everyone in the community is notionally part of the audience for the text. And the same with tragedy, right? That's aimed at a community audience. In many places, you move after that towards a literature built more around the court. And then gradually, in later periods, as there's more of a middle-class audience that's literate and can maybe afford to buy manuscripts or eventually printed books, then there's that kind of mass.
So the audience actually in the Western tradition contracts somewhat after Greece, it's a heyday.
Or the texts that we have certainly are aimed at a different audience. Homeric epic does seem to be something that mass audiences, such as they existed, would have listened to. Virgil does seem to be a little bit more explicitly writing for an imperial audience, or an audience of elites. And that's not to say that the masses in Rome obviously weren't engaged in listening to song and story, just that the kinds of things they engaged with didn't survive.
Your work on the ecology of world literatures sort of takes the sovereignty of the reader, or the readership at least, as the key independent or variable. So you're going to follow forward on that, I guess, in this particular work. Do I have that right?
Yeah, in the sense that how we link text to each other is a practice of the reader as much as it is of the author. It can be of the author too, right? I mean, authors often very explicitly announce, even in their own work, I'm writing this book to be, I'm Virgil, I'm going to bring epic to Rome. I'm going to tell you exactly what my goal is, but it also always matters how audiences actually then interpret and process those claims, and the kinds of connections that readers make themselves. And readers, over time, I think, build some kind of idea of a literature, of American literature or British literature or Roman literature, through the things they read, the things they don't read, and the connections they make amongst them.
So the author has the readership in mind, its interests, its capabilities, its referential frame when he or she is writing.
Well, I mean, I think authors frequently
works both ways, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but authors aren't always able to succeed in getting the audiences they hope for, right? We all know how that can be challenging.
So you think that the literatures of the world, in some sense, are flowing together, that they're becoming, you're worried about it, but they're becoming, the various language traditions are perhaps becoming less numerous, or might over time, and that several of them are in various degrees dominant, and that this presents a challenge for the future ecology of world literature, because it's healthy, as in a biological ecology, to have diversity.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is sort of a question we face, right? I mean, I think we're all aware of the global spread of English in our time, and as English speakers ourselves, there's some good things about this, there's some convenient things about this, and there are some practical advantages for the world at large to share a lingua franca of some kind, obviously. But there is a danger that if literature moves in the same direction too far, that it becomes difficult for people in many places to find themselves in the texts that they read. If texts are increasingly produced for a global audience, they're produced not for the entire audience, I think, but for a certain layer or slice of society everywhere in the world. And texts, and we see this historically, I think, as well in earlier traditions. The broader that a language and literary tradition reach around the world, the thinner the slice of each culture that embraces that literature. And I think there's a certain danger with that, with a kind of homogenous global literature in our time too, is that it becomes a literature maybe of global elites who speak English and who travel a lot and who participate in a kind of global economy, and it doesn't become a literature that speaks to more local and more specific communities, which still needs to happen very much in local languages often.
Might it be that as you have, you call it what, a hyper-dominant language? Is that what your reference to English is? If you have a language like that a lot of people know as a secondary language, if it's not their native tongue, doesn't that conceivably at least turn it into a kind of interface in which more linguistic communities can communicate with each other, not through English itself, but through the fact that they're all translatable into English, and hence can be accessed by anyone who at least has English under their command as a secondary language?
Well, that certainly could be true. I'm not sure that it is. I mean, famously, more texts are translated into German or Spanish or French than into English. And some of that is because, of course, many of those texts translated into German, French, or Spanish are translated from English, and therefore don't need to be translated into English. Mm-hmm. But even when you account for that, in many cases, it's easier for a novel written in, say, a minor European language or some of the non-Western languages to find an audience in German or Spanish than it is to find an audience in English.
And why is that?
I think English speakers, as a group, we've been historically reluctant to, first of all, to learn other languages, which is important to me as someone who teaches in the foreign language department, but also to read, therefore, texts, even in translation from those languages. I think that's just been a historical reluctance of
We
English
have
speakers.
this kind of superfluity of works, and
Yeah, and a kind of confidence that we can understand everything we need to understand about the world through the medium of English. That means that not as much has sometimes been translated into English.
so if you're growing up as a German speaker or Polish speaker, and you regard yourself as someone who's going to be an educated person and move in the larger world, you realize from the outset that you had better master another language, and it's probably going to be the first candidate is English.
The first candidate is going to be English, but if you're that Pole, maybe you also
Might
think
do a few others.
you might do German too,
Yeah,
right? You might realize, well, actually there are ways in which I can't fully communicate with Germans through English. Both of us are kind of then talking with one of our hands tied behind our backs, and if we work on other languages. And I also think it's just generally true that once you begin to think in more than one language, it becomes easier to add more languages, to that system.
So, as a last question, I'm going to ask you about your experience as an actual teacher.
Sure.
But I gather do you teach introductory language courses or not?
Sometimes I do, yes.
Sometimes you do. And those are courses that are often being taken by students as a requirement. So do you encounter this sense that, this is really not an essential undertaking for me? I can survive very well in the world without whatever the language would. I guess it would be what, Chinese?
Well, if I teach beginning language, it's Greek or Latin.
So
it's definitely
it's an antiquated language, right? So, well, then maybe in the case of a living language, someone else doing it, you think the students would kind of come and say, well, I have to do this. And maybe I want to get a good grade for my overall GPA, but I don't really think that this is going to matter very much in my life.
I mean, I think that is an attitude that people sometimes do come in with. Again, it's the kind of the bonus we have as English speakers of not as urgently needing these other languages. But I think it's important to communicate to students, and I think by and large, say at my own institution, we're doing a good job of this. It's important to communicate to students all the things you can't do if you don't have access to other languages. And it's sure you can go anywhere in the world and find someone you can talk to, but you're talking then on very selective terms with a very selective group of people, and you're missing out on a great deal of the experience of the country and the culture in which you're involved if you can only communicate with people through the medium of English. And I was just in India last week, as a matter of fact, and I mean, there's famously a country with many people, millions and millions of people who speak English very well, and yet it's very clear when you're there that if your only access to people in India is through English, there are hundreds of millions of people you're not going to be able to talk to at all. Other people you can have only a kind of limited access to, and there are parts of people's lives that are lived in other languages that are very hard to carry across into English.
Well, thank you for an interesting discussion, which I'm sure is going to send our viewers away eager to renew their studies of ancient Greek, ancient Chinese. I'll think about it myself. But it's been stimulating, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much.